Hello and welcome to the latest edition of Citrus Insights. I've got a fantastic guest joining me today. I'm delighted to be welcomed by Lindsay James, investment strategist and media spokesperson at Quilter Investors. For those of you who haven't seen us interview Lindsay before, Lindsay joined Quilter as an investment director at 2019, I think it was actually, Lindsay, before becoming investment strategist responsible providing external commentary on the markets, speaking to the national press and media. I know, Lindsay, you're a regular face now on Sky News, the BBC. You have commentary on Radio 4, Wake Up to Money, and indeed on CNBC Europe. So given all those major broadcasters that you work with, I am thrilled that you found the time to join me today. Thank you so much, given how busy you are.
Oh, it's an absolute pleasure for me. Thank you for having me.
Lindsay, I recorded commentary on the day of the elections last week. So we're going to talk, I think, let's start on the UK. I know we're going to branch out perhaps and talk a bit more about the rest of the world. But my commentary last week on election day was remarkably how calm everything seemed. So I guess we're about a week on from the election result, and it'd be great to have your view on, is everything still calm from a UK perspective, or have things changed a bit in the last week?
No, I think calm is a very good way to put it. We've seen sterling continue to strengthen a little bit. We've seen the FTSE 250, which is the best marker for the sentiment towards the UK economy. We've seen that up a little bit. Gilt yields haven't really moved at all. So I think we can safely assume that the market was expecting this. Now, we had Labour ahead in the polls for the last 3 years. So it had a bit of time to get used to the idea, if you like, that we would have a Labour government. Of course, the polls weren't completely spot on, as ever. The share of vote was quite a lot lower than I think many people had expected. But nevertheless, we ended up with the same result. So markets, yes, have been really quite relaxed about the change of government that we've got here.
Okay, thank you. And I guess the commentary and rhetoric over the last, I don't know, particularly I think the last week, but in the preceding weeks, a lot of debate around growth and how is the UK going to growth given some of the kind of restraints that we're experiencing at the moment, given higher interest rates and government borrowing. So I guess from your perspective, what are the latest rumours that are circulating over how Labour are going to tackle monetary policy in order to drive growth in the UK?
Well, of course, monetary policy is really only going to be influenced by the Bank of England. The best thing that the Labour Party can do as government to influence that in any way is try and do anything to try and soften inflation. And then it means the Bank of England can move. So the biggest issue for inflation at the moment is wages. We've got wage inflation still running at around 5%. That is therefore meaning service cost inflation is pretty high still. We've got goods inflation coming down, and that means the headline rate has come down. That's now at 2%. But we've got core inflation, so that strips out energy and food. That's still running at about 3.5%. So this is why the commentary from the Bank of England is still cautious on the pace of rate cuts. And this is why we haven't had any yet, even though inflation is nominally, at least, back at target. So I think, what we need to see really is moves to potentially address labour supply. Now, the UK is quite rare, and it's one of the only 6 countries in the OECD, which is 38 countries, so one of 6 that's seen its labour participation rate come down in the last 3 years. So it's come down from around 76% before the pandemic to about 74% now. And this is one of the reasons why wage inflation is quite high. And when you try and unpick that further, you can see that one of the reasons people aren't working is because of ill health. And therefore, we need to think about what can be done to address that. Now, in some cases, it's genuine ill health, it's long COVID, or it's the fact that their operations have been delayed multiple times by the NHS, or other genuine health factors. In other cases, I think the fit note culture has potentially been used to fill a gap in the benefit system because you can only claim, for example, unemployment benefit and job seekers allowance for a very short space of time, realistically. So a lot of people use this therefore to try and make ends meet when they aren't working. So, there's different tools that Labour might want to look at to try and incentivize people to get back to work, but I would hope to see some of that coming through to address inflation. Then we can start to expect more in the way of substantial rate cuts coming through. But at the moment, The market's really only expecting 2 by the end of the year. So the first potentially in September, the second potentially November, but this does move around. And then the longer term outlook suggests rates are only really likely to trough at 3.5%. So quite a different interest rate to one that we've seen in the last decade. And you touched on growth as well. And I just wanted to address that point a bit more if I can, because we had UK GDP data out this morning. It was month on month data, and that showed growth of 0.4%. Now, that's not bad. It sounds tiny, but the market was expecting half of that. And last month, we got no growth at all. So it really is quite a big pickup. Within that, we saw construction surprising. So that was up 1.9% month on month. I think a lot of that is weather related, to be honest. So, having looked out the window and seen stormy skies for the last week, I think that could infer that June potentially give some of that back. But nevertheless, we are seeing a little bit better growth coming through in the UK, and there are some tools that Labour can use, even in the absence of having a lot of money in the bank, to try and do what they can to accelerate that.
Thank you. I have to say, I'm fascinated to watch this. Just a couple of bits that you said there in terms of people kind of encouraging people to get back to work where possible. And it didn't just stop me for a minute and think, I'm sure I've heard this back to work budget phrase used before. So it's going to be fascinating to see what Labour can do if indeed you're right. I mean, I talk regularly on Citrus Bite about this wage growth that just keeps going in spite of how the inflation data comes out. So yeah, interesting to see what Labour, or indeed the Bank of England, of course, can do to try and influence that. And then just hearing what you're saying, how does one of the things that has been announced over the last few days is this National Wealth Fund. So clearly, that's not something that's been talked about that much. It'd be great to have your views on what actually is that about, and B, why is there a need for it?
Yeah, sure. So if we just contextualize as well the environment that they're inheriting at the moment, there is currently a £30 billion shortfall in the primary deficit. Horrible technical term, if you like, but this is basically just government revenues less spending, excluding interest costs. That's quite a big hole. Now, at the moment, they're funding that through long-term debt, but the IMF has told them, and markets are very clear on this too, that you really do need to stabilize this appetite for taking long-term debt. We have to see that happen within the next 5 years as well to get it on a stable footing. So they've got to close this hole in the budget. So they're going to have to increase their revenues, and they're going to have to think a little bit about service provision as well and cost saving where they can. So there's very little money to do anything that is going to accelerate the economy. Now, the National Wealth Fund is an example of where you can use a very small amount of money and have a bit of a shot at the moon here. So it's 7 billion pounds, effectively. That's what they've capitalized it with. This is moving money on the UK balance sheet. It's not money spent. It's money that's going to be invested to try and remove blocks to private investment coming in. And they've focused this on a few different areas. So one of these is gigafactories. So these are large scale factories, typically powered by renewable energy, that are used to make EV batteries. And this is a sort of term that's come across from the US as we try and slowly develop our EV industry. Now, they've flagged the issues with developing these factories. Are things like the fact that our vehicle manufacturers already have supply agreements with battery manufacturers. We don't have capability on the renewable energy front. Even if you're developing a new renewable energy project, it could take 12 years to connect that to the grid at the moment. And there's multiple other blockers here. We don't have a ready supply of lithium. So they're thinking about how they can target this capital to potentially offer guarantees. For example, it might be purchase guarantees from if batteries can be built, then there would be a guarantee that they would be purchased at the end of that. Things like that, little guarantees, equity and debt arrangements as well, to try and get some of these initiatives off the ground, to crowd in, if you like, private investment. Because at the moment, when you look at kind of the backdrop of some of these areas they want to focus on, and it's things like green steel, green hydrogen, industrial decarbonisation, there's too many blocks for private investment to come in. So they'd want to use this in a really targeted way to remove those blocks, and then hopefully you'll see the private investment follow. But this is a small amount of money in the scheme of things. It's not diverting anybody's pensions or anything like that. And it gives the UK just one chance at a slightly higher rate of growth in some niche areas.
Okay, that's interesting. Thank you. And I know we could touch on that for a moment, because not using pension money, I know there was also quite a lot of speculation in the run up to the election. I think there are models, I'm not an expert on them, for example, Australia, where a certain amount of pension money is diverted to help, and that funds kind of local domestic growth and jobs. And obviously then the British ISA, I think it was, that was created in the last budget statement. I think people are still waiting for quite a lot of detail behind the whatever the British ISA is designed to be. So is there any change? Maybe let's focus on is what's announced as now kind of coming out, apart from Rwanda, which seems to be absolutely dead in the water from what we can tell, from a monetary policy or from a policy perspective. What else is there that might be immediately removed by Labour?
Okay, so again, two things I want to say at the outset of that, which is firstly, you're absolutely right that other countries have got more of a focus on their domestic economy from their pension sector. We don't. So it's only around 2%, something like that, of public sector pensions are invested in UK equities here, compared to something like 40% in Australia. So there's lots of, but the equity market, the UK equity market, is a completely separate beast to the UK economy. So there is different ways which you can try and accelerate the UK equity market, and that has to come really from making it more attractive for international investors. And just today, we had the FCA announcing a raft of proposals to try and make it more tempting for companies to list here. But yes, there is currently this sort of view that domestic investors will want to invest internationally rather in the UK economy. And I think, to be fair, it's right that we are seeking those returns first and foremost, rather than being forced to buy something that maybe would see those returns reduced. So that's just a different way to look at it. When I think about what the Labour Party might chuck out, to be honest, it's difficult for me, because the Conservative Party didn't have an industrial plan, and their net zero policy had been substantially torn up in recent months, to be honest. So they were such a low interventionist party, and the Labour Party really quite different in terms of their wish to be more involved, more heavily involved, in a bigger role for the state. And I think that's kind of being mirrored as well in cultural changes that I see in the UK. And I think this is really been accelerated since the pandemic too. This idea that the state does need to play a role when we look at the sewerage going through our rivers, the inequality that we've got in society as well. I think people are probably coming around to the fact that we've tried light touch and it hasn't really worked that well. So let's see what the alternative might offer us. And when we listen to what they've already said, they've said quite a lot. To be fair, given they've been in power 6 days, I think at this point, they've made some very early announcements. They've shown a huge amount of energy to kind of get that ball rolling very, very quickly. At the moment, we've got Keir Starmer away at the NATO conference. He's quite savvily taken his sort of person in charge of European relations with him, his person in charge of defence with him, and plans to have conversations at that NATO conference about selling UK defence equipment into Europe, given Europe have said they're going to be buying a lot of defence equipment in coming years. They want to buy European. We want to make sure that we're seen as Europeans. So they're not missing a trick on that front. We've also had Rachel Reeves coming out and giving a big speech at the Treasury. She's already seen, overruled the policy on onshore wind, so that is now eligible for development, whereas it effectively was banned previously. And she's alluded to big changes coming through in planning reform as well. So they're trying to think about what they can do with very little, because there is no money to spend. It has to be more imaginative than that. And I think what we have seen so far is that they've got quite a lot of imagination. So, I'm politically neutral, but the signs at this point, I think, are that they're energized, they're informed, they understand the fiscal constraints that the UK is under, and they have some ideas they're pushing forward. So for me, it's a good start.
Yeah, okay, thank you. And thanks for so much of that detail. And just maybe pick up on one thing, because I think let's just talk about wind energy. I was interested to hear that comment about onshoring, and I'm thinking about the announcements over, the UK needs hundreds of thousands of new homes. There's been talk about green belt, grey belt, I'm not sure, all different terminology over land. Maybe you can just clarify that. Are you expecting to see a significant uplift in the amount of house building going on? And if so, what land is potentially at risk, if you like, from the extra build?
Yeah, no, that's all very fair questions. And this definition of the grey belt, I think, is going to be a problem because it's pretty vague. They've talked about it being sort of ugly land, such as car parks that are disused, such as disused kind of waste industrial space. But they've also said it could be on the green belt. It could just be next to the M25, for example. So it's a bit too wishy-washy to stand up to rigorous planning requirements at the moment. And I think that's going to cause its own challenges when it comes to trying to push through new developments in areas where there previously wasn't any. And but this is needed because, it comes back to the fact that it's just a matter of months ago, it was Buckinghamshire Council that rejected a massive data centre that will happen to be on land that adjoined the M25. So it had no amenity value whatsoever. It wasn't in an AONB or nothing like that. And it could only be seen from one particular flyover, but it was rejected on the basis of, well, this is land that is otherwise just an open field. It was very spurious. And we really need to have infrastructure like that coming in, because I think a lot of the problems people have with house building is that the infrastructure doesn't necessarily support the number of homes that need to be built. So and to that, they haven't given figures yet to the number of homes they want to see built. I think they're going to go with the 300,000 a year number that the Conservatives attempted. But let's face it, we've got nowhere near that since the 1970s, when there was a huge program of social building. So I think it's going to be pie in the sky for a while. But planning is a major issue. The IMF raised this as their number one growth idea for the UK to ease problems in the planning system. And I think, it's right that they are looking at this again. We can't just expect our current cities to absorb the number of homes that we do need. There's a huge shortage of housing. The amount people have to spend on housing has shot up in the last few decades, and it's causing all sorts of damage to the economy, not least, in family formation, and the fact that we now have a falling fertility rate, part of which is the fact that people just can't afford to move out of home. They can't afford to have those extra bedrooms that they'd need. So this is a long-term problem that does need solving. But I think, because of that vagueness about what constitutes acceptable land, it's still going to face a lot of headwinds in those local planning departments. So no big changes, I suspect, in terms of that rate of build.
Perfect. Thank you. It feels like we could spend ages talking about the UK, and I'm really mindful, of course, that the world is a big place. And as much as we've talked about maybe calmness within the UK, there's obviously some really big events playing out elsewhere in the world over the next few months, whether it be France, whether it be the USA. So it'd be great to get your views, thinking about an investor here as well. How concerned should we be about the big events that are yet to happen? For example, with the France final elections taking place, and then in the USA?
Well, yeah. So the France, we've seen this complete swing from worry about it going to the hard right to worry about it going to the hard left. And it looks like we're going to have something in the middle, which basically means stasis, I think, for the French economy for the next 12 months until they can vote again. And because of that big swing, where would it go in 12 months' time? Massive uncertainty. And then we've got the presidential election coming up in 20, I think it's a couple of years beyond where we are now. So a lot of uncertainty is going to overhang the French economy, and that is going to affect growth because businesses are going to say, you know what, I don't know that I want to invest when there's this much, of an unknown quantity in policy making. So that is a problem for France. I think Germany could have watched this election and gone, you know what, we don't want that. So, they did see a big swing in the polls as a result of the European elections. They saw a big swing to the right as well. But whether that will actually feed through in their elections in 2025, I think we'll have to wait and see. I would think that there's been an element of changed minds, to be honest, after watching the French situation in recent weeks. For me, the biggest source of uncertainty, though, is over in the US. We're in this horrible situation where we've got the leader of the free world, who is perhaps not fully compos mentis, whose strings are being pulled by unknown others at this point in time, and where his vice president is ahead of him in the polls for the next election. So that's very unusual this close to an election. And of course, the other candidate, Trump, he's proposing trade tariffs. He's proposing, again, potentially breaking up NATO, switching off funding to Ukraine. Things that if he actually does could be quite damaging, but it's that question if he actually does it. He was surrounded by quite bright people last time around, and they seem to sort of protect him from himself to some degree. So I think, we're going to have to see how that plays out. But I would say that there's phenomenal strength in the US economy, and that's coming from innovation that is like a genie. It's out of the bottle. You're not going to destroy that, whoever's in the White House. And that's really powering the stock market. Now, there's a case of our expectations for this a little bit high at the moment. It's certainly been the case in recent years that the market has underballed earnings, if you like, and actually these stocks have done even better than people were expecting. So I'm relatively neutral on this. I think that this is potentially a theme that could continue, but I don't think it's one that's going to get derailed politically. And with interest rates cuts coming as well, I think that will shore up the equity markets reasonably well.
Okay, thank you. And probably a good place to finish. I know you always actually make that really valid point around difference between economies and stock markets. And thinking about investors now, they're hearing a lot. There's a lot of it is not based on actual fact. It's prediction and ifs and buts and maybes. I think the first fiscal statement from a UK perspective is unlikely to be until September odd, I think.
That's right, yes.
So if I'm an investor and I'm hearing all this kind of noise go on as always, and inflation remaining higher than everyone forecast, and interest rates not coming down as quickly, how do I just sit on my hands? Is that do I need to kind of try and stop reading the press and what should I be doing?
Yeah, so I would say don't stop reading the press, because I think the world is changing, and I think it's fascinating the changes that we're seeing, and it's good to be prepared for it. But perhaps be careful what you do read, or if read balanced opinions as well. Seek out the opposite view from something that you do read, just to challenge that. I think it's important to always take a step back and look at the big picture. So yes, we're told there's a lot of political uncertainty at the moment, and that's kind of true, but equally the UK is being seen as quite a nice, safe place to invest now, having been out in the cold really since the Brexit vote. It compares very favorably to European governments at the moment, even compares quite favorably to the US. We've got certainty for the first time in quite a long time. So that's quite a nice, new positive. Our home market is likely to do better as a result. When we look at the overall global economy, I think, yes, there's some signs the US is slowing, but this is good news because inflation has been a problem. And so if the economy is slowing a little bit, that would suggest that inflation will come down a little bit more quickly, and it will bring rate cuts more quickly too. That supports financial markets. And when we look at underneath the hood and see what's happening in businesses, they're also seeing earnings growth coming through, and that's going up more quickly year after year. So just as earnings only grew about 5% in the US last year, they're likely to grow about 10% this year and even higher next year. So this is all quite a nice backdrop for investments, particularly with interest rates likely to be coming down through this period as well. So, I would always encourage people to kind of read both sides of the story and take that step back and think about the bigger picture over their investment time horizon, and not try to get too spooked by the short-term stories as well, if you like. I know there's been quite a lot of flags signaling about potential for tax rises under Labour. Now, it's true, capital gains tax, IHT, could be in their sights come September. But I would say that there are different ways you can prepare for that, and the financial advisor that you have is going to be best placed to guide you through that. But certainly there are a few strategies that you could use if that's a particular concern.
Lindsay, that feels like a great place to end. Thank you, because actually there's plenty of positives in there that I've taken away. And whilst there are no guarantees, I agree. There feels like underneath everything, and there are a lot of positives going on right now. So so it's been absolutely fantastic to hear from you today. So insightful as always. Thank you ever so much. Please, when you can find the time, we'd love to have you back again at some point, if that's okay.
I'd love to. Thank you.
Brilliant. In the meantime, that's all for today on Citrus Insights. Thanks ever so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you again very soon. Take care and bye for now.